Imagine a tool that would allow new developers in your organization to understand where to get the source code of the applications they need to work on, what's needed on the workstation to build it, and what configuration or setting they need to have to run it. People in QA could also use this. It would allow them to be completely independent every time they install and test the application. DevOps could also use the same tool to install the application in a cloud environment or proprietary servers. Here's a twist. That tool exists, but you can't buy it. You have to build it. That tool is called technical documentation. Creating clear, concise, and useful documentation is not an easy task. A lot of times it's overlooked, especially in smaller organizations. In bigger organizations, it's usually mandatory and for good reasons. If you're a solo developer and the person testing and deploying the application, it's probably not worth investing the time and effort to create this type of documentation. And it's usually the same in a small team where there's only a handful of people. As a rule, I would say less than 5. Unless, of course, you want to make sure you have a contingency plan for the hit by a bus risk. However, if you want to grow quickly and onboard new technical people, you will see that technical documentation will be an incredibly valuable tool. If you're not sure whether you need it, here's a few pointers. You have repetitive questions from team members or anyone else who asks the same questions over and over and over again. You need help onboarding new team members, especially if you have to invest a lot of time educating them on where to find things and how to deploy or build an application. Only some people know certain things about an application or a project. You're essentially accepting to be dependent on those individuals. Knowledge, especially the critical type, has to be spread out. Your team members are working with complex systems. People are making a lot of mistakes, especially repeating the same mistakes. There's a lot of changes within the teams. People are not necessarily leaving the organization. They could simply be moving around. There's a high chance that you're going to lose some knowledge, or at the very least, that knowledge won't be easily accessible. Of course, you should have sessions to transfer the knowledge, but let's be honest. If you're doing that, you might as well write it down, which is essentially the very nature of documentation. You're in an industry with strict regulations. To remain compliant, you should document the sensitive areas so that the proper procedures are respected, and you reduce the risk of crucial team members making mistakes. You want to grow a team, especially quickly. You need to maintain some standards and consistency. You need to reduce the pressure on existing team members and avoid turning them into full-time coaches or teachers or walking FAQs. You dislike getting emergency phone calls at 3 a.m. Maybe you should consider writing down some key things about the application, especially how to do maintenance and updates. If you like emergency phone calls at 3 a.m., well, I can't help you. There are safety or security concerns. It becomes necessary to make sure that all your procedures are clearly understood and followed. The best way to do this is to include them in the documentation. There isn't any golden rule as to where to publish documentation or what form it should take. However, let me say this. The documentation should be easily accessible by those who need it. It should be simple to update by those with the knowledge, and you should have a backup plan if the website, wiki, or online service you're using to host your documentation becomes inaccessible. I don't have any preferences whether you use Google Docs, Word documents, or an online wiki. Whatever works for you and your team is probably your best choice. If the documentation needs to be accessible by external parties, make sure that you consider that in your choice, or you at least provide an option for them. So you decided to create documentation, and you've ensured that you need it at your organization's or team's current size. What are the things that you should know? First of all, it can be very time-consuming to write and maintain documentation. If developers are involved in maintaining the documentation, let's be clear that they will do less coding. Your documentation can rapidly become obsolete in an environment where things change frequently. When that's the case, you may want to develop a strategy to keep up possibly hire more resources, or if that's possible, maybe there are some parts of the documentation that could be automated. Document maintenance is time-consuming and must also cope with things that change frequently. You may eventually have to have a conversation about resource allocation. This is usually one of the biggest challenges, especially in a smaller organization. The nice thing, though, is that in smaller organizations, it's usually easier to gauge whether or not the amount of time you save with the documentation outweighs the time invested. Make sure your documentation is simple and manageable. The last thing you want is for people to ask you where things are in the documentation or to explain the documentation itself. If you're getting those questions, the documentation is a failure. Remember that one of the core goals is to reduce repeated questions. It's possible but unlikely that those questions come up because of a lack of expertise or lower IQ on the reader's part, but I doubt it. An excellent way to address those two challenges is to link technical terms to an outside resource that explains them. Your documentation should be accessible and easy to find and not require granting security permissions to read it. If it contains confidential information, you may want internal and external versions. Be very careful if you ever decide to have an external version. You've just doubled your overhead. Also ensure that if your documentation is accessible to the outside, it doesn't provide too much internal information so that malicious people can use it against you. You might have to produce documentation in multiple languages if you deal with a global context. Personally, I would stick with English. Most people who work in technology can read and understand English, since we're talking about technical documentation here rather than user documentation. You'll rarely encounter a situation where a technical person requires anything in another language other than English. If you think I'm wrong, let me know why in the comments and the context. Here's my recommendation. Suppose you have a team of more than 5 or 10 people. In that case, you should seriously consider at least having an FAQ or some essential documentation to avoid having repetitive questions. The intent here is not to produce documentation for the end user. The intent is to provide information for technical resources for them to perform tasks independently. If every time you hire someone you have to explain where the source code is, and you know that you're about to hire 3 people in the next month, you may want to seriously consider putting that information in a document instead of individually coaching these 3 people and making sure they can use the document instead. You can answer any exceptional questions. I love a platform where people can read the documentation and ask questions in the documentation. A lot of word processors have a function for readers to leave comments. If the people in charge of the documentation review those comments, let's say daily, they can then adapt the documentation to answer the questions. They should not answer the question as a reply to the comment. They should modify the documentation and mark the comment as completed. If the reader still needs help understanding, they can repeat the process. If that doesn't work out, then you can call a meeting. The intent here is that you will have documentation that will grow through need. When things grow organically, it may be a more significant challenge to keep it organized, but it will be easier for you to determine what questions and what information people need instead of guessing. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you enjoy this type of content, consider subscribing. It really helps out the channel. Are there any subjects that you would like to see? Leave it in the comments.